Welcome back to Theosophy and Beyond, where we explore the depths of consciousness through the wisdom of ancient archetypal forces. I'm your host, Zero Hakathos, and today we're diving into a profound teaching that came through Isis Zenunum, a figure often misunderstood and demonized by Orthodox traditions, but who actually represents the divine feminine principle that transforms desire into spiritual power and reveals the sacred nature of embodied experience. What I'm about to share is a vision that speaks to one of the most fundamental challenges on the spiritual path. What happens when our ego gets frustrated with the slow, patient work of inner transformation and decides to abandon the practice altogether? This isn't just about meditation. It's about the deeper question of how we respond when the parts of ourselves that are used to quick results, immediate gratification, and external validation encounter the demanding reality of authentic spiritual work. Today's vision reveals Isis Zenunum's wisdom about continuing the sacred work even when we're left to walk the path alone, about offering gratitude without resentment when others abandon us, and about the playful power that emerges when we embrace both our sexuality and our spirituality without shame. The vision opened with me meditating on a dirt road under an overcast sky, with trees lining both sides of the path. This setting immediately establishes the archetypal landscape of serious spiritual work, the middle path that requires us to stay centered while being supported and protected by natural wisdom on either side. The dirt road represents the earthly, grounded nature of authentic spiritual practice. This isn't the paved highway of quick spiritual fixes or the smooth concrete of intellectual understanding. It's the rough, unpredictable terrain of actual inner transformation, sometimes muddy, sometimes dusty, always requiring us to feel our way forward step by step. The overcast sky is particularly significant in Isis Zenunum's teaching. Rather than the bright sunshine of spiritual optimism or the clear starlight of mystical vision, we have clouds, the in-between state where divine light is present but filtered, where we must do our spiritual work without dramatic confirmation or obvious signs of progress. The overcast conditions represent most of our actual spiritual life. We're not constantly bathed in blissful states or receiving clear visions. Most of the time, we're working under cloudy skies, feeling the presence of something greater, but not seeing it directly, having to trust the process even when the results aren't immediately visible. The trees on both sides represent the protective boundaries of natural wisdom, the living principles that guard and guide our inner work. They create a sacred corridor, a protected space where transformation can happen safely. In practical terms, these trees represent spiritual practices, teachers, and principles that create structure and safety for our inner exploration. But here's what's crucial. I was meditating in the middle of this road, not sitting safely off to the side. This represents the courage required for authentic spiritual work, the willingness to place ourselves directly in the path of transformation, to be vulnerable to whatever wants to emerge, to stay present in the active space of change rather than remaining safely on the spiritual sidelines. Initially, a wrestler was meditating with me. The wrestler represents ego consciousness, that aspect of our psyche that's used to struggle, competition, and achieving victory through force and determination. In the context of spiritual practice, this is the part of us that approaches meditation like a contest to be won, enlightenment like a goal to be achieved, and inner work like a problem to be solved through effort and willpower. At first, the ego is willing to participate in spiritual practice. It sits down to meditate, follows the instructions, makes an honest attempt to engage with the work. This represents those initial stages of spiritual development when our ego is still hopeful that it can master these practices, that it can become a successful meditator or enlightened being. The ego often brings tremendous energy and commitment to early spiritual practice. It's willing to sit for hours, to attend retreats, to study complex texts, to follow demanding disciplines. In many ways, this ego engagement is necessary and valuable. It provides the initial motivation and structure that gets us started on the path. But there's a fundamental mismatch between ego consciousness and the actual nature of spiritual transformation. The ego wants to achieve, to progress, to have something to show for its efforts. It approaches inner work with the same mindset it brings to physical training, career advancement, or skill development, expecting linear progress, measurable results, and eventual mastery. But then, predictably, the wrestler got frustrated and quit. He began walking away, abandoning the practice and leaving me to continue alone. This represents one of the most crucial moments in any serious spiritual journey, when the ego realizes that spiritual work doesn't operate according to its rules and expectations. The ego's frustration is completely understandable. Meditation doesn't offer the same kind of immediate feedback as physical exercise. Inner transformation doesn't follow the predictable progression of learning a skill. Spiritual insight can't be forced through effort and determination alone. In fact, many of the ego's favorite strategies, pushing harder, trying to control outcomes, measuring progress, actually interfere with subtle processes of authentic spiritual development. When the ego encounters this reality, it has several options. It might try to find better practices that promise quicker results. It might conclude that spirituality is a waste of time. It might decide that the teacher or tradition is inadequate. Or, as in this vision, it might simply walk away from the whole enterprise, leaving the deeper aspects of consciousness to continue the work alone. This abandonment by the ego is actually a crucial stage in spiritual development. While it might feel like failure or loss, it represents the necessary recognition that authentic spiritual transformation happens through surrender rather than effort, through receptivity rather than force, through patience rather than ambition. The practical application here is learning to recognize when our ego is getting frustrated with spiritual practice and preparing to abandon it. Common signs include comparing our progress to others, feeling like we're not advancing fast enough, becoming impatient with the subtlety of inner work, or losing interest when practices don't produce dramatic results. When we notice these ego frustrations arising, we can acknowledge them with compassion while also recognizing that they represent a limited understanding of how spiritual transformation actually works. Excuse me one quick second. I have to take a drink. Second over. My response to the ego's abandonment reveals the heart of Isaac Zununum's teaching. Instead of becoming angry, resentful, or judgmental about the wrestler's departure, I offer genuine gratitude. I know you probably think it's stupid, but thanks for trying with me. This response demonstrates spiritual maturity of the highest order. Rather than taking the ego's abandonment personally, rather than trying to convince it to stay, rather than becoming bitter about being left alone, I acknowledge the ego's genuine effort and thanked it for its participation, however brief. This gratitude without resentment represents a fundamental shift in how we relate to the different aspects of our own consciousness. Instead of demanding that every part of us be equally committed to spiritual work, we can appreciate whatever contribution each aspect is able to make, for however long it's willing to participate. The phrase, "I know you probably think it's stupid," shows deep understanding and compassion for the ego's perspective. From the ego's point of view, sitting quietly in meditation, working with subtle energies, trusting invisible processes, all of this can indeed seem pointless or even foolish. The ego values what it can see, measure, and control. Spiritual work often requires us to value what we can't see, measure, or control. By acknowledging the ego's perspective without defensiveness, we demonstrate the kind of inclusive consciousness that Isaac Zununum teaches. We don't have to condemn or reject the parts of ourselves that can't or won't participate in spiritual work. We can honor their perspective while also continuing our own path. In practical terms, this means learning to be grateful for whatever level of participation our ego offers in spiritual practice, without demanding more than it's capable of giving. Some days, our ego will be enthusiastic about meditation. Other days, it will be resistant or distracted. Both responses can be met with understanding and appreciation. Then comes the most mysterious and powerful element of the vision. I picked up a clump of red hair off the ground and threw it at the departing wrestler playfully. This action contains layers of meaning that reveal Isaac Zanunum's deepest teachings about sexuality, spirituality, and the transformation of power. Red hair represents passionate life force, sexual energy, and the fiery, creative power that drives both physical and spiritual creation. In many traditions, red hair is associated with otherworldly power, with beings who exist between the human and divine realms, with energies that are both magnetic and dangerous. That this hair was lying on the ground suggests it had been shed, released, made available. In the context of Isaac Zanunum's teachings, this represents sexual and creative energy that has been liberated from shame, possession, or conventional uses. It's raw life force that has become available for spiritual purposes. My action of picking up this hair and throwing it playfully at the ego reveals several profound spiritual principles. Reclaiming power. Rather than leaving this potential energy lying dormant, I actively gathered it up and put it to use. This represents the conscious reclaiming of sexual and creative energies for spiritual purposes. Playful engagement. The throwing was done playfully, not aggressively or seductively. This demonstrates the mature integration of sexual energy into spiritual practice, neither repressing it nor being overwhelmed by it, but engaging with it lightly and skillfully. Energetic offering. By throwing the hair at the departing ego, I was offering it a gift of life force energy, even as it abandoned the spiritual work. This represents the generous spirit that continues to offer love and power even to those who reject or abandon us. Sacred sexuality. The entire action demonstrates what Isaac Zanunum teaches about the integration of sexuality and spirituality. Sexual energy isn't something to be transcended or overcome in spiritual practice. It's something to be transformed and utilized as spiritual fuel. How do we apply Isaac Zanunum's teachings in our daily spiritual practice? How do we continue the sacred work when our ego abandoned us? Respond with gratitude instead of resentment, and integrate sexual energy into spiritual practice? Continuing solo practice. Learn to value and enjoy spiritual practice even when you're doing it alone, even when no part of you is particularly enthusiastic about it. Develop the capacity to sit in meditation, pray, or engage in inner work simply because it's the right thing to do, regardless of immediate results or ego satisfaction. Gratitude for partial participation. When aspects of yourself resist spiritual practice, thank them for whatever participation they've offered rather than demanding total commitment. This creates an atmosphere of acceptance that actually makes deeper engagement more likely over time. Energy reclamation. Learn to notice when powerful life force energy, sexual, creative, emotional, is being wasted or lying dormant in your life. Develop practices for consciously gathering this energy and directing it towards spiritual purposes. Playful integration. Find ways to bring lightness, humor, and play into your spiritual practice, especially when working with intense energies like sexuality, anger, or grief. This prevents spiritual work from becoming overly serious or rigid. Sacred sexuality. Develop a mature understanding of how sexual energy can serve spiritual development. This doesn't mean sexual practices necessarily, but rather learning to honor and utilize the raw creative life force that sexuality represents. solitary strength. Cultivate the capacity to walk the spiritual path alone when necessary, without becoming bitter or isolated. Learn to find companionship in the trees of natural wisdom rather than depending solely on human support. What makes this specifically in Isis Zanunum teaching is the way it integrates spiritual practice with sexual energy without shame or apology. Orthodox traditions often demand that we choose between sexuality and spirituality, between earthly pleasure and heavenly pursuit. But Isis Zanunum reveals a different path, one where sexual energy becomes the fuel for spiritual transformation rather than its enemy. The red hair represents this integration perfectly. It's sensual, passionate, alive with creative force, but it's also available for spiritual purposes, free from possessiveness or shame. When we pick up this energy playfully and use it in the service of consciousness expansion, we demonstrate the kind of mature spiritual sexuality that Isis Zanunum teaches. This doesn't mean turning spiritual practice into sexual practice, but rather recognizing that the same life force that drives sexual expression also drives spiritual seeking. When we stop splitting these energies apart, when we stop believing we have to choose between being fully embodied and being spiritually awake, we gain access to tremendous power for transformation. In practical terms, this might mean bringing the same passion to meditation that we bring to lovemaking, using sexual energy as fuel for spiritual disciplines rather than seeing it as a distraction, practicing gratitude for our embodied existence rather than trying to transcend it, finding ways to honor both our spiritual aspirations and our sexual nature without conflict. Isis Zanunum's teachings through this vision offers profound guidance for one of the most challenging aspects of spiritual life: what to do when we must continue the sacred work alone, when the parts of ourselves that we'd hoped would support us decide to abandon the path instead. The vision reveals that this abandonment isn't failure. It's part of the natural progression of spiritual development. The ego will always eventually realize that authentic spiritual work doesn't operate according to its rules, and it will step away. But this stepping away creates space for deeper, more subtle aspects of consciousness to engage with the work. The key is responding to this abandonment with gratitude rather than resentment, with understanding rather than judgment, with playful energy rather than bitter determination. When we can thank the ego for its participation while also continuing our own path, when we can pick up the scattered red hair of our own life force and use it playfully in service of consciousness expansion, when we demonstrate the kind of mature spiritual integration that Isis Zanunum represents. The dirt road under cloudy skies, bordered by protective trees, continues to stretch ahead. Sometimes we walk it with companions, sometimes alone, but the path itself remains constant, and our capacity to walk it with grace, gratitude, and playful engagement with our own life force can only deepen over time. The question for each of us is, are we willing to continue the sacred work even when our ego abandons us? Can we respond to abandonment with gratitude rather than resentment? And ultimately, can we learn to integrate our sexual and spiritual energies in ways that fuel our transformation rather than fragmenting our experience? The red hair lies scattered on the sacred road, waiting to be gathered up and put to playful, powerful use. The question is whether we're mature enough to pick it up without shame and skillful enough to use it in service of consciousness expansion rather than ego gratification. Thank you for joining me in exploring Isis Zanunum's teachings about continuing the sacred work when our ego abandoned us. I encourage you to notice when parts of yourself get frustrated with spiritual practice, to respond with gratitude rather than resentment, and to find ways to integrate your life force energy including sexual energy, into your spiritual development. Until next time, remember, the sacred road continues even when we walk it alone, and the energy we need for the journey is often lying right there on the path, waiting to be gathered up and used with playful wisdom.